What kind of fool do you take me for? He's Squidward, you're Squidward, I'm Squidward!
Every year in gaming discourse, there always seems to be one or two big titles that are viewed as the divisive ones. They're titles that usually have a large amount of people who love them, just as many who hate them, and without fail, it will cause some of the most unnecessary vitriol on the $44 billion cesspool. This can range from a game lacking in content on launch, being indescribably broken, or an obnoxious melting pot that makes me never want to goddamn see them again.
Get the fuck out of here!
Usually this divide can be seen coming, and while it hasn't been as blatant or hostile, I think it's safe to say Final Fantasy XVI has swiftly found itself in this category, but not for the reasons you may initially think. It's not that this game is busted or bare bones or problematic. No, the controversy for this game comes down to if Final Fantasy XVI is even a Final Fantasy game at all. Now, before we get started, I want to establish out the gate that this video is not going to be a review or critique of FF16. If you want some super basic thoughts, I think the game is very good. Great even. It does have some glaringly noticeable flaws that I may explore in a future video that keep it from being truly amazing, but I do ultimately really like the game and would recommend it. What I want to explore today is what has even caused this fracture in the fan base. Why exactly is FF16 being called not a Final Fantasy game by a certain crowd? How we reach this point, and why I think those people may actually have a more understandable viewpoint than many may initially judge. FF16 is not a Final Fantasy game is not a good critique, but it is a sentiment that buried beneath the surface lies a notable observation about the state of the series and is worth exploring for why it exists. The aspect that primarily drives this not a Final Fantasy game mindset is how 16 goes for a far more action game style rather than that of an RPG. More specifically, a turn-based one. Now, in fairness, Final Fantasy hasn't been turn-based for many years, and has shifted more towards general action combat structure pretty consistently since 15. However, this current divide is a result of just how strong the shift is this time around. Unlike 15 and 7 Remake, which did have more action but still a fairly strong presence of heavy RPG elements, 16 is basically just Devil May Cry. It's almost like a platinum game with how its moment-to-moment gameplay works out, and the actual RPG aspects of the game, such as the skill unlocks, weapons, armor, and leveling, have been boiled down to an absurdly basic state that it can be almost jarring for a long-time RPG fan to see just how simplistic it all is. But I feel like this pushback on it not being a Final Fantasy game has less to do with 16 specifically, and more that this game was the straw that broke the camel's back on this topic for people. This is probably going to be controversial to say, but I think there's a genuine argument that Final Fantasy as a series feels lost on what exactly it wants to be, and can't seem to nail down a particular gameplay style that it wants to follow. Now, the people who push back on this current rhetoric will often point out that Final Fantasy always made changes to its gameplay from title to title, and was never a full retread between main entries. And while that is somewhat true, I would argue that's a bit too much of a blanket statement that doesn't get into the more nuanced facets of the situation. Yes, it is true that Final Fantasy changed aspects of its core with every mainline game. Whether it be the character-specific abilities in 4, the super deep job class system in 5, the Magicite in 6, the materia in 7, etc. However, while there were alterations, FF1 through 10 all had far more in common with one another in their general structure and overall design than pretty much all other mainline Final Fantasies that came after. These games had their differences, but they all felt like they were a part of a clean through line and all built off the same general core design. But that began to change after FF10. I don't know if Square felt they dug all they could out of what Final Fantasy had done up until that point, but it really felt like they wanted to try shifting away from turn-based combat post-FF10-2. Post-FF10-2. God, say that to any non-gamer and see how they react.
Excuse me, the fuck did you just say?
But it feels like in their desire to move away from turn-based combat, they didn't have a clear plan for what they wanted next, so they just began throwing shit at a wall to see what would stick. You have 11, a seemingly good but mostly abandoned MMO, 12, a real-time RPG that felt like a precursor to Xenoblade, 13, a return to turn-based combat but it was 14, another MMO that started but ended up 15, which started to establish a more action-oriented style but had a number of noticeable flaws. 7 Remake, which seemed to mostly refine 15's combat into something really good. 16, which is, again, Devil May Cry. And then we're going back to the previous style with 7 Rebirth. Like, fucking hell, boys, pick a lane. You see what I mean when I say it feels like Final Fantasy is lost? They've barely managed to stick to a particular style for the better part of 20 years now for their mainline games. And while it's starting to seem like they've settled on wanting to go for a more action style with the past 3 titles, it also feels like the team is worried about making the games too similar to Le Funny Big Key Boy, and so they can't even settle on a particular setup they want to have for that. It's becoming all the more glaring when you compare it to other big names in the genre. Like, take Dragon Quest and Pokemon, for example. For as much as can be said about both those series, and trust me, for Pokemon there's a lot that could be said, no one can deny that these series know what they want. They have a core, a nucleus of the franchise that they abide by while still attempting to make things feel fresh with new ideas, for better or for worse, and still holding true to the foundation of the franchise. These two are confident in what they are, and you know what you're going to get when you pick one of them up. Whereas with modern Final Fantasy, it seems as though they only have the very basic idea of wanting it to be some type of RPG, but completely alter the mechanics game by game, creating entirely different styles of gameplay that aren't necessarily bad, but cause fans to latch onto various different types, so now you have a very splintered fan base that will argue over which of their 5 to 7 particular styles is better and should be a true basis for the series. And I would just like to stop for a moment to ask if that last statement sounded familiar to fans of a certain blue rodent. Again, probably a controversial statement, but I don't think it's much of a stretch to say Final Fantasy is kind of running into a similar problem Sonic had for a really long time. Now, granted, Final Fantasy has been much better off than Sonic, considering even at its lowest points, FF never got anywhere near as consistently rough as Sonic. Like, 13 is bad, but it ain't this. But I think it can be argued the not a Final Fantasy rhetoric spawns from a similar place. One other aspect I think really hasn't worked too well in Final Fantasy's favor is the overall drop in consistent quality the series has had since the early 2000s. Now again, Final Fantasy never fell this far, but I believe many would be hard-pressed to argue against the sentiment that, as a franchise, Final Fantasy is nowhere near on the consistent godly level that it used to be. With the debatable exception of 8, FF4 through 10 are all masterclass RPGs that still get heaps of praise decades later, with 6, 7, and 9 in particular often being seen as some of the highest pinnacles of the entire genre. But, as I've repeated many times now, that all started to change once they bolted from the established formula. Since then, we've had 2 MMOs, one forgotten and one that eventually got good, a decent Xenoblade-like, some dog shit, and a flawed game with one of the most infamously troubled development cycles in history. It is genuinely not unreasonable to say the first mainline single-player Final Fantasy game to get an immediate majority positive reception since 10 was 7 Remake, nearly 20 years later. Fucking woof. And now we have 16, which does seem to continue the more positive sentiment, but its heavier lean towards action further alienates the longtime Final Fantasy fans who love the more intricate RPG facets after they came off a long stretch of time where the overall quality paled in comparison to what they once knew. It's also exasperated by the length of time between main entries. with the games getting much further spread out compared to how it was in the 90s. So these longtime fans either wait several years for a game that was mediocre, or has a completely different style from one or multiple previous formulas they grew attached to. So with all that being said, what do I think Final Fantasy's solution is here? Well, it's like I said earlier, pick a lane. Right now, the question of what is a Final Fantasy game is something that I don't even know Final Fantasy itself could answer, outside of something vaguely having RPG elements. I think right now, FF should step back and take a good look at what it wants to be and reestablish a new core that the series will build off of going forward, much like how it did for 1 through 10. Personally, the FF7 remake formula is what I would base the series on going forward, primarily because it feels like the perfect blend of being more action-based, as well as having much deeper mechanics that are a big hit for the turn-based fans. Honestly, this game, it's just... God, it's so damn good. But I also wouldn't mind the 16 style getting a redo in 17, and work out all the kinks that befall the game we have now, like the shallow mechanics, poor pacing, and weak side quests. What matters right now is that they simply stick to one formula rather than what that formula specifically is. Final Fantasy needs to find a concrete foundation again, to take each game and build off of it, instead of completely tearing out the foundation and crafting a new one every single time. As someone who's a fan of turn-based games, I don't necessarily mind Final Fantasy not adopting them as much as they used to. We have plenty to go around. But I think it would do both the fan base and the franchise as a whole a lot of good if it finally settled in on what it wanted to be. If we do that, the statement, "it's not a Final Fantasy game," doesn't even have to be stated. Is it turn-based? Is it real-time? Is it action RPG? Character action? It's up to you, Square. Just make that definitive choice.
The choices are yours and yours alone.